A small group of people stood huddled in the corner of the ship's deck, listening intently to the translator. As he spoke, their faces drained of color, their bodies heavy with realization. On June 12, 1898, Emilio Aguinaldo and his fellow Filipino revolutionaries listened to the words that would shatter their dreams of freedom. The interpreter was relaying a message from Commodore George Dewey, the leader of the American naval force that had recently defeated the Spanish fleet. The message was simple. Aguinaldo should join the Americans in their fight against Spain, and once the war was over, he would be given complete autonomy for the Philippines. However, there was a catch. The Filipinos were merely tools for the Americans to defeat the Spanish, and their own independence was not something that was going to be discussed. "We want your assistance in taking possession of Manila," the message read. "We do not desire to control, govern, or interfere in any way with the people of the Philippines. When peace is established, the question of government will be open for discussion." While on the surface it looked like a promising alliance, in reality it was the beginning of a bitter betrayal. The Americans had come to steal the Philippines, a task that they began by shattering the Spanish colonial empire. When the smoke cleared over Manila Bay, the Spanish fleet was destroyed. 3 centuries of colonial power lay broken at the bottom of the sea, and the Filipinos, watching from the shore, they felt liberated. To them, America was the land of democracy and individual liberty, a beacon of enlightenment where equality reigned. What better friend could they have in their quest for freedom? But what looked like a golden opportunity for the Filipinos turned into a nightmarish scenario. The Americans, with their advanced weapons, strategic planning, and political clout, exploited the situation to fulfill their own ambitions, leaving the Filipinos high and dry. The Spanish might have been brutal and conservative, but they were going to leave. The Americans, however, had no such intentions. They were here to stay. To truly appreciate how America stole the Philippines, we need to wind the clock back a bit. For more than 300 years before 1898, the Philippines had been a colony of Spain. It wasn't a particularly kind ruler either. Exploitation was rife, and the native Filipinos were kept as second-class citizens. By the end of the 19th century, the Filipinos had had enough, and they rose up in arms against the Spanish. There was only one problem, though. Their army, although valiant, was ragtag and ill-equipped. Fighting against a well-disciplined, well-funded colonial army was like David versus Goliath. Realizing their predicament, the Filipinos reached out to America for help. With their military prowess, the Americans could easily defeat the Spanish. In return, all the Filipinos had to do was pledge their loyalty and support them in the war effort. It seemed like a good plan, and for a while it worked out perfectly for the Americans. The Filipinos were fierce warriors. Under the leadership of their generals, they launched a series of attacks that forced the Spanish to retreat. However, it soon became clear that the Filipino rebels were not willing to simply play second fiddle to the Americans. Their vision was clear. They wanted freedom, not just a change in colonial rulers. Unfortunately for them, America didn't see things the same way. Once the Spanish were kicked out, they had no intention of handing over power to the Filipinos. On August 13, 1898, the Americans took Manila, but not from the Filipinos. They simply walked into a city that was already under the control of the Filipino army. General Elwell Otis, the American military governor, sent a letter to Aguinaldo explaining that since the city was in ruins and its inhabitants were without government, he had decided to take charge. The letter continued, "You will at once withdraw your troops from the city, and turn over to me all public property of every kind belonging to the Spanish government which may be in your possession." Aguinaldo was furious. Hadn't they fought shoulder to shoulder against the Spanish? Wasn't this the very purpose of the alliance? But his protests fell on deaf ears. In effect, the Filipinos were being asked to recognize American authority over the very territory they had liberated. Aguinaldo refused, believing that the Filipinos had earned their independence. But the Americans weren't keen on honoring their end of the bargain. Instead, they showed who was really in charge. In Manila, American soldiers patrolled the streets. Their presence was everywhere. inescapable. Aguinaldo and his followers felt humiliated and betrayed. The Americans had stolen the Philippines and they weren't even trying to hide it. But Aguinaldo knew that he couldn't fight the Americans militarily. So he turned to diplomacy. He sent an envoy to the United States to demand recognition of Philippine independence. But his mission failed. The Americans weren't interested in granting them freedom. In December 1898, the Filipinos learned the truth about the situation. Spain and the U.S. had met in Paris to decide the fate of the Philippines, and the Filipinos were not invited to the table. How could they claim to liberate the Philippines while denying the natives the right to participate in their future? But the Americans didn't care. The Treaty of Paris was signed on December 10, 1898. The treaty stated that Spain had officially ceded the Philippines, along with Guam and Puerto Rico, to the United States for $20 million. The Filipinos were not a commodity to be bartered. They were human beings whose lives, aspirations, and destinies were being decided by superpowers who had no regard for their rights. This wasn't simply about land ownership or economic gains. It was about denying a people their basic right to self-determination. It was about robbing them of the very essence of freedom that they had struggled so hard to attain. For the Filipinos, this was a national trauma. All their sacrifices, all their struggles, and all their hopes and dreams were suddenly worthless. The Americans had used them, exploited them, and now they were discarding them like a used tool. But they wouldn't accept this defeat lying down. A revolution had been sparked, and it wouldn't be extinguished so easily. The Philippine-American War lasted from February 4, 1899, to July 4, 1902. Although the Filipinos displayed incredible bravery and military skill, they were no match for the Americans. They were overwhelmed by the sheer firepower and strategic capability of their enemy. In the end, the Filipinos lost. Aguinaldo was captured and sworn allegiance to the United States. He hoped this move would end the bloodshed, but it only fueled the fire. Smaller groups of Filipinos continued to resist American rule through guerrilla tactics. These groups were led by men like Macabulos and Lapula. They waged a war of attrition, striking at American targets and disappearing into the dense jungles before reinforcements arrived. They knew they couldn't win a direct battle, so they made the war last as long and as painful as possible. The war wasn't just about guns and battles, it was also about winning the hearts and minds of the people. And in this aspect, the Filipinos had the advantage. The Americans were seen as outsiders, as a foreign power that had come to exploit and control the Philippines. The Filipinos used